So my project is called a Pan-Canadian Comparison of Provincial Cyanobacteria Management Policies, Programs, and Practices. So as a lot of you probably know, cyanobacteria is commonly referred to as blue-green algae, is a naturally occurring photosynthetic bacterium that under the right conditions can proliferate to form blooms. These right conditions are light, temperature, nutrient concentrations, thermal stratification, and anoxia, so no oxygen conditions. They have been increasing in frequency and severity globally, but as well as in Canada. So things like, or places, lakes like Lake Erie, Lake of the Woods, Lake Winnipeg, and Lake Champlain are all water bodies experiencing cyanobacteria blooms. Blooms are a problem because they can produce cyanotoxins, which in high enough concentrations are poisonous. They also produce noxious taste and odor compounds and build up surface scum, which combined with cyanotoxins increase drinking water treatment plant costs. And they can also result in anoxia. So when blooms die and decompose, they decrease dissolved oxygen content in water and cause hypoxic or anoxic dead zones, which can kill multicellular life. So the main cause of cyanobacteria blooms is believed to be eutrophication, which you can see examples of on the left. So eutrophication is excessive concentrations of nutrients in a water body that result in increased biological productivity and decreased dissolved oxygen concentrations. The main nutrient of concern for cyanobacteria blooms is phosphorus. So there are two forms of anthropogenic pollution that results in cultural eutrophication, which is sort of the non-natural side of things, which are point source and non-point source forms of nutrient loading. So point source nutrient loading is loading that comes from easily identified or confined spaces, such as sewage or wastewater treatment plants and storm drains. Non-point source nutrient loading is nutrients that enter the environment from diffuse sources. So as a result of the hydrological cycles, so things like agricultural or urban runoff. And then of course, there's also internal phosphorus loading that can contribute to blooms. So this is when phosphorus found within lake sediment is released during conditions of low or no dissolved oxygen within water. So in addition to eutrophic systems receiving or having cyanobacteria blooms as a result of eutrophication, oligotrophic or nutrient poor systems are also now seeing blooms within Canada. And while not a lot of research has been done on this topic, the current suspected cause of the occurrence of blooms in these systems is due to increasing thermal stratification of water, which leads to anoxia in these lakes along the bottom of the lake. And certain species of cyanobacteria are actually able to migrate into these anoxic waters in order to secure ferrous iron and phosphorus from the sediment water interface in order to promote population growth. And it also allows them to outcompete eukaryotic algae. So that's the diagram on the right. Okay, so how we manage cyanobacteria blooms in Canada is nutrient management and risk management. So nutrient management is the active reduction of nutrients from anthropogenic sources. Point source nutrient loading is dealt with mainly in wastewater treatment plants using chemical or biological means of phosphorus or nutrient reductions. And then there's non-point source controls, and this is generally achieved through agricultural stewardship programs, through the use of best management practices. And this is the idea that if we manage how we apply phosphorus or where, things like that, that we can sort of control how nutrient runoff occurs, so we can decrease it. Then there's also BMPs that are natural heritage protection. So protecting riparian zones, that's the picture on the bottom. So that sort of grassy or planted area between water bodies and the shore, and wetland protection and restoration, because both are capable of like uptaking or removing nutrients from soil and preventing it from reaching the water. So my research, the main objective of my research is to identify and compare current cyanobacteria bloom management strategies for lakes from 5 provinces in Canada, namely Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and Nova Scotia. 3 research questions or objectives guide my research. So the first one is, how is each province responding to the presence of cyanobacteria blooms? The second question is, do any of the provinces have plans to address blooms through changes to nutrient management or risk management processes? And are provinces adapting to the new scientific understanding of blooms forming in oligotrophic systems? The last one is particularly important because this new understanding could allow us to manage blooms in nutrient-poor systems, and it could also allow us to adopt more stringent or site-specific phosphorus loading targets for eutrophic systems. So the methods of my research are a policy analysis, a case study analysis, and then interview with key stakeholders, which is how I'm here today. So my policy analysis is where I use a framework to assess legislative materials, primary literature, government documents and reports, and governing bodies documents and reports to find out about cyanobacteria management in each of the provinces. I then selected case studies in each of the provinces, 2 in Ontario, in order to assess implementation of these policies. And then I am interviewing key stakeholders such as regional NGOs, federal, provincial, and municipal government officials in order to get a holistic understanding of the application of these policies. So my preliminary results, what I found so far is that adaptation and or risk management is prioritized over mitigation, which I'll get into over the next several slides. So, non-point source nutrient management. All provinces have some form of legislation around manure management, both its storage and application. However, only Ontario and Manitoba have required nutrient management for phosphorus and nitrogen, including land application rates for manure or fertilizer use. Manitoba is especially unique in this case because they have 2 regulations that cover small and large producers. So that's the Livestock Manure Mortalities Management Regulation under the Environment Act and their Nutrient Management Regulation under the Water Protection Act. So these 2 regulations require manure application rates be based on soil phosphorus levels or require fertilizer, which is manure, fertilizer, and biosolids, their application rates be based on soil type and phosphorus levels in the absence of an approved plan. Ontario's nutrient management only applies to large producers, and while nutrient management strategies for storage of manure require approval, nutrient management plans, which are actually around the application rates of nutrients, do not. And there are no set levels for phosphorus for soils in the legislation or regulations. Both provinces also have required setback distances and incorporation methods for manure application, and they have limitations around the application of manure to frozen soils or snow-covered soils. So then there's also voluntary programs. So all 5 provinces have voluntary or incentivized best management programs. So all the provinces are signed onto the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, which is a joint federal and municipal fund for each of the provinces' environmental farm plan programs. So EFPs are a voluntary self-assessment tool that allows farmers to identify areas of environmental concern for their operation and the associated BMPs they can use to implement to address these concerns. However, there's several problems with this program. The first being the program is voluntary, making implementation of these BMPs optional. It's based off of a whole farm assessment, which means that multiple different environmental areas of concern are identified and the operator has the choice of which BMP they want to implement. And lastly, implementation isn't tracked unless funding is applied for in most of the provinces. So while the EFP assessment is mandatory in order to apply for a lot of these BMPs, the fund are for under the Canadian Agricultural Partnership. That's really the only method of tracking. So if they don't apply for funding, they may or may not, implement any of these BMPs. And Saskatchewan actually doesn't require them to conduct the EFP for a lot of the funding under the Canadian Agricultural Partnership as well. So another example is the 4R program. So that's an industry-led fertilizer application management program for farmers. The idea is that fertilizer is applied using the 4 R's, so right time, right rate, right source, right place. If fertilizer is applied in this manner, the idea is it should reduce nutrient runoff from farms, protecting water sources from nutrient loading, but also maintaining crop yield at the same time. Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Ontario have signed on to this program, but Nova Scotia has not. So while Ontario and Manitoba do have more comprehensive methods of nutrient reductions, the goal overall for both the regulated and non-regulated nutrient management methods is to protect water quality in general, rather than focusing on mitigating cyanobacteria blooms. So phosphorus targets have not been developed under these nutrient management acts, and only Manitoba has used the Water Protection Act nutrient management regulation to identify at-risk water bodies in order to enforce more stringent phosphorus protection or phosphorus reduction, which are occurring in all of the provinces. So several of the provinces, namely Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario, have all put in provincial-wide guidelines for total phosphorus effluent standards. So in Alberta, it's 1.0 micrograms per liter, and they can use biological or chemical methods. Manitoba is also 1.0 micrograms per liter, but they prefer using biological methods of phosphorus reduction. In Ontario, it's a range of 0.5 to 1.0, either biological or chemical. In Ontario, the idea is that all municipally managed wastewater treatment plants should at least meet the 1.0 milligram per liter standard. However, some plants do actually have those more stringent levels of 0.5. It's dependent on location or season. So in certain seasons, wastewater treatment plants around identified at-risk water bodies are required to have meet the 0.5 limit. Whereas, and same with all of the wastewater treatment plants around Lake Erie, they're also supposed to meet that. Some of the, however, so in the other two provinces, Nova Scotia and Saskatchewan, rather than setting sort of province-wide total phosphorus effluent limits, they set them on a case-by-case basis. So when they issue the license to the wastewater treatment plant, that's if and when they tell them they have to meet phosphorus reduction requirements. And I would also like to say that in this case, all of the provinces set these limits via the license, but these provinces, Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario, set them for all of the licenses. However, the ability for the wastewater treatment plants to meet these levels is limited by their capacity. So if they're a primary, secondary, or tertiary treatment plant, they may or may not be able to necessarily meet these limits, especially depending on their methods of wastewater treatment plant. Tertiary is really the best method, obviously, because they just have the most sort of different methods of treating the effluent water. But they're really the best way for pointed removal of phosphorus from effluent waters. Sorry. Okay, now I'm going to go into risk management. So all of the provinces have recreational water monitoring programs or sort of public water monitoring programs for blooms. So Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan all have recreational beach monitoring programs, which are handled by different ministries within the provinces. So in Alberta, it's their, in Manitoba, it's their Agriculture and Resource Development Ministry. In Alberta, it's Alberta Health and Alberta Health Services, and in Saskatchewan, it's the Ministry of Health and the Saskatchewan Health Authorities. So in Ontario, in Ontario, Nova Scotia, they only respond to public reporting of blooms. They don't have any sort of beach monitoring program. And Alberta and Manitoba both have public response protocols in place for blooms outside of their beaches. Saskatchewan says that they may or may not respond to some reported sightings of blooms outside of their beach program. But they assess it on a case-by-case basis, and they say it's not often. So I'm just going to do a little bit of a comparison between two of the beach monitoring programs. So in Manitoba, they monitor approximately 60 different beaches annually during the summer months. So it's actually May to September. They respond to public reporting. So if somebody calls in from the beach, they will respond to that. But otherwise, they do weekly, monthly, or once per season monitoring, and they conduct an annual sort of site assessment protocol to see which ones they're going to visit weekly, monthly, or once per season based off of popularity of the beach and past occurrences of blooms and E. coli. Sampling is conducted when a bloom sighting is confirmed or suspected. So they test, they do cell counts and species present counts. So they look at each individual type of cyanobacteria species that's present and count them. And they also test for the recreational water level, which is 20 micrograms per liter. So that's the federal recreational water level that is implemented, or that the guideline was developed by the federal government and has been picked up by several of the provinces, Manitoba and Saskatchewan being two of them. So they issue an official advisory if the cell count or the microcystis level is exceeded, or if they count enough of the genus of microcystis being present in the water. If the second one is the case, they will set up for resampling in about a week to see what the toxin levels are after the bloom has decayed, because that's when they release the toxins. An advisory is issued online into the media and is also shared with any impacted municipalities. They also put signage up. They have a dedicated provincial algae advisory sign, which you can see on the bottom of the slide. Saskatchewan, on the other hand, only monitors 15 to 20 beaches. Same thing, weekly, monthly, or once per season, and that's from June to the September long weekend. They do a similar assessment based off of popularity of the beach and whether or not blooms have occurred frequently in the past. And they do not respond to public reporting. That's not part of the Ministry of Health's protocol. Sampling is conducted regardless of visual confirmation. So they use what's known as the ELISA test strip. And if it's positive, they conduct the Abraxas ELISA test in the lab. The problem with this is that you can get false negatives with the test strip. So they issue a caution advisory if the test strip is positive or if they confirm the sighting of a bloom. They issue an advisory if the 20 micrograms per liter count is exceeded. And they issue a closure if they determine the water quality to be a serious risk due to the presence of a bloom. So exceedance of the 20 micrograms per liter is not cause for a closure. They issue the advisories online and to the media, and they actually do an annual media advisory to the public as well, usually in July. And they have signage for both the caution and the advisory specific to toxic algae. And you can see there is up above for the algae advisory. So then I'm going to do a comparison between the public reporting, the response to public reporting only. So that's Ontario and Nova Scotia. Neither of them use the federal guideline for recreational waters, that 20 microgram per liter maximum acceptable concentration for the cyanotoxin MCLR. But Ontario has a dedicated line to report bloom sightings, as I'm sure you guys are aware. That's the Spills Action Center, or you can call directly into the Ministry of the Environment's district office. The district office will follow up if the bloom is suspected or confirmed and notify the local health unit as well. And then the Ministry of the Environment conducts a field assessment and collects samples. So they do algae IDing, they do the ELISA lab test, and then they'll do LCMS if they think, or if the ELISA test shows that toxin concentrations are high, just to get a better count of toxin levels. It's just like a more stringent test. The local health units are the ones that decide on whether or not to issue an advisory, and they'll do so first when they receive the notification of the suspected bloom, and again upon receiving the samples. So they'll decide if they issue it in the occurrences of a bloom, and then they'll decide again whether or not to lift it or keep it in place, depending on the results. Nova Scotia does not have a dedicated line to report sightings of blooms. So people have to call into the district or regional Nova Scotia environment offices to report sightings. The sightings are confirmed either by having calling the person who reported it and having them send photos, or they may do a site assessment. If the bloom is suspected or confirmed, they will issue an advisory. They do not do any sampling. And when the sighting is confirmed by Nova Scotia Environment, they notify the Ministry of Health, and they're the ones who issue the advisory. So drinking water quality. All of the provinces utilize the federal guideline of 1.5 micrograms per liter of the microcystis MCLR, the toxin, for municipally and or provincially regulated drinking water treatment plants. So depending on the province, this may or may not apply to sort of small drinking water treatment plants. Monitoring is necessary for treatment methods and risk management or advisory issuance. The frequency of monitoring varies across provinces, but visual inspections at intake and sampling are always delegated to drinking water treatment plant operators via the issuance of their license. Notification of exceedances to appropriate ministries are also delegated to the approved labs where the samples are submitted, or to the drinking water treatment plant operators, generally both. And the drinking water treatment methods vary between drinking water treatment plants based on their capacity. So there are drinking water treatment plants that are not capable of filtering out cells and the cyanotoxins. So routine monitoring, a bit of a comparison there. So Alberta, if Alberta Environment decides based off of sort of past environmental data that because of the occurrences of blooms, there's a risk to the public, they will require under the license weekly field inspections. Raw and treated water sampling is required if a bloom is cited, and then they'll issue an advisory depending on the results of those samples. Nova Scotia requires weekly visual monitoring at the intake, and if a bloom is observed, the operator is required to notify Nova Scotia Environment. And if Nova Scotia Environment issues an advisory, that's when a water sample is collected, and they will either maintain or remove the advisory depending on what the results of the tests are. And in Ontario, all drinking water treatment plants are required to conduct weekly field inspections as of May of 2019 under the harmful algae bloom monitoring condition for licenses, but only drinking water treatment plants where blooms have occurred in the past require raw or treated water sampling, or if a bloom sighting is confirmed or suspected. And then an advisory will be issued depending on the results of those tests, mostly based off of the test of the treated water if it exceeds the 1.5 micrograms per liter MAC. So my research on oligotrophic lakes. So Ontario, Manitoba, Alberta, and Nova Scotia have all confirmed that they've received reports of blooms occurring in nutrient-poor lakes within their provinces. Ontario is currently studying the cause with the aim of incorporating that knowledge into current policy. Alberta is attributing it to climate change, but there's no research currently ongoing. Manitoba is attributing this to eutrophication, and Nova Scotia, there's no research currently ongoing. And Saskatchewan did not confirm or is unaware if there are any blooms in oligotrophic lakes in their system. Currently, none of the provinces are working to incorporate the new understanding of bloom cause into existing policy, though Ontario is working on it. So my case studies. I split my case studies into 3 categories. The first one is lakes that are actively managed by the have total phosphorus load targets developed. BMP use is either promoted, incentivized, or mandatory for some within the affected watersheds, and have legislation and regulations in place in order to protect water quality and reduce phosphorus loading into the lake. So that's Lake Erie in Ontario, Lake Simcoe in Ontario, and Lake Winnipeg in Manitoba. The other two, or the next category is lakes that have municipally or locally developed management strategies for cyanobacteria blooms. These lakes are actively monitored by local watershed groups and have conducted lake water quality studies and bloom causation studies for the lake watershed. BMP use is promoted by the watershed groups, though they lack legislative authority and to enforce them. And they've also all published education documents on the risks associated with blooms and some of the causes. Phosphorus loading targets have not been developed. So that's for Pigeon Lake in Alberta and Nolan Lake in Nova Scotia. And then the last lake I chose is Buffalo Pound Lake in Saskatchewan. This final lake has no dedicated lake management strategy. However, water quality is protected under an integrated watershed management plan called the Lower Qu'Appelle River Watershed Plan. Phosphorus loading targets have not been developed for the watershed or for Buffalo Pound Lake, which is a slight problem because it's actually a drinking water source for 25% of the population in Saskatchewan. BMP efficacy for phosphorus reductions is currently being studied for that lake, but BMPs are not currently being promoted in order to reduce bloom occurrences in that lake. Monitoring is conducted by the Healthy Beach program for the beach that's on the lake and by the drinking water treatment plant at the intake area. So that's all of my preliminary results for right now. Does anybody have any questions?